The consensus among 20th century historians placed the arrival of human beings in the Americas at approximately 13,000 years ago. According to this narrative, small bands of hunters crossed a temporary land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska during the final stages of the last ice age. These people, identified by the distinctive stone projectile points found near Clovis, New Mexico, supposedly migrated southward through a narrow opening between two massive ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet covered eastern Canada, while the Cordilleran ice sheet covered the western mountain ranges. The corridor between them was a cold, barren passage of mud and meltwater that opened as the climate warmed. For decades, academic institutions accepted this timeline as absolute. Archaeologists rejected any evidence of human presence that predated the Clovis tools. The Clovis point was a highly effective weapon, bifacially flaked with a distinct flute or groove at the base. This flute allowed the stone head to be fitted securely into a wooden shaft. The design required high-quality flint or chert, which hunters carried over vast distances. The spearheads were designed to hunt mammoth and bison. The physical mechanism of radiocarbon dating supported early chronologies, yet it eventually dismantled them. All living organisms absorb carbon isotopes, including radioactive carbon-14, from the atmosphere. When an organism dies, this absorption stops. The carbon-14 begins to decay at a predictable rate, halving its quantity roughly every 5,700 years. By measuring the remaining carbon-14 in organic materials like wood, charcoal, or bone, scientists calculate when the organism died. In the late 1970s, Tom Dillehay, an anthropologist working at Monteverde in southern Chile, uncovered organic materials that challenged the Clovis timeline. The site lay in a cool, damp forest, preserved under a layer of peat that prevented oxygen from decaying the organic matter. Dillehay found wooden structural supports, mastodon meat, and wild potatoes. The radiocarbon tests on these specimens returned dates of 14,500 years ago. This was more than a millennium before the Clovis corridor in the north was ice-free. To reach southern Chile by this date, people had to travel thousands of kilometers. They could not have walked through the glacial corridor. Instead, researchers began to investigate the Kelp Highway hypothesis. This theory suggested that early maritime travelers used skin boats to navigate the Pacific coast. They lived on fish, shellfish, seabirds, and kelp, which grew in abundance along the shoreline. This coastal route allowed rapid travel without the need to cross high mountain ranges or glaciers. The debate shifted further south in the early 21st century. In New Mexico, within the dry basin of the Tularosa Valley, lies White Sands National Park. During the Pleistocene epoch, this area was not a desert of white gypsum dunes, but a large, shallow body of water known as Lake Otero. The lake was surrounded by lush grasslands, which attracted large mammals including mammoths, giant ground sloths, and dire wolves. In 2021, scientists analyzed fossilized footprints preserved in the lake bed. The prints belonged to teenagers and children who had walked through the mud along the ancient shoreline. The mud dried, and subsequent layers of sediment buried the tracks, preserving them. The weight of the walkers compressed the sand and clay, leaving impressions that remained visible after the lake dried up and the wind eroded the topsoil. To date these tracks, geologists collected seeds from the aquatic ditchgrass Rupia maritima, which were embedded within the sediment layers directly above and below the footprints. Using radiocarbon dating on these seeds, researchers established that the footprints were made between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. This placed humans in the southwest of North America during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered the northern half of the continent. The physical mechanism of track preservation requires specific environmental conditions. First, the soil must contain a precise balance of moisture. Too dry, and the sand slips without holding the shape. Too wet, and the water flushes the details away. As a foot presses into damp silt, it displaces the grains, forcing them downward and outward to form a compressed boundary layer. If the sun bakes this layer before the next tide or rain event, the clay particles fuse slightly. When new sediment washes over the hardened print, it fills the cavity without mixing with the original surface. Over thousands of years, mineral-rich groundwater deposits calcium carbonate, or gypsum, into the gaps, cementing the shape into stone. This discovery meant that humans lived in North America long before the glaciers began to melt. These early inhabitants witnessed a landscape populated by megafauna that are now extinct. The presence of children's footprints suggests a settled community rather than a temporary hunting party. The children carried water, gathered plants, and played near the water. The dry lakebed of the Tularosa Basin held these impressions for thousands of years. At the height of the last ice age, massive sheets of ice covered Canada. These glaciers blocked the land route to the south. The ice sheets were over a mile thick. This physical barrier made walking through the interior of the continent impossible. Yet humans lived in New Mexico during this frozen era. To reach the south, these early travelers had to find another path. The coast offered an open passage. While the interior was locked in ice, the Pacific shoreline remained clear of glaciers. Travelers moved along this coastal route using watercraft. The construction of these early vessels required specific materials and techniques. Builders constructed frames from flexible wood. They used willow or spruce branches. The builders bent these branches into a curved framework. They lashed the joints together with animal sinew. Sinew shrinks as it dries, which pulls the joints tight. Over this wooden frame, they stretched animal skins. Sea mammal hides worked best because of their thickness and oil content. The builders stitched the hides together with waterproof seams. They used a double running stitch that pulled the leather tight. Then they coated the seams with animal fat or seal grease. This grease repelled the water. The resulting boat was light and flexible. It did not break when hitting waves or rocks. Instead, the frame flexed to absorb the impact of the water. Paddlers sat low in the craft to keep the center of gravity stable. These boats traveled through the kelp highway. Kelp forests grew along the coast from Asia to South America. The dense kelp plants calmed the ocean waves. The plants acted as a natural breakwater. This calm water allowed small skin boats to travel safely. The kelp forests also provided constant food. Fish lived in the kelp. Shellfish clung to the rocks beneath it. Seabirds nested on the cliffs nearby. Travelers did not need to carry large stores of food. They harvested what they needed from the water each day. The physical evidence of this coastal travel remains difficult to find. During the Ice Age, vast amounts of water were locked in glaciers. The sea level was 90 meters lower than it is today. The ancient coastlines were far out on the continental shelf. When the glaciers melted, the oceans rose. The water covered the old campsites and tool-making areas. These sites now lie under deep ocean water. Silt and sand cover the remains. This underwater environment prevents normal archaeological excavation. Archaeologists find clues on islands that were never connected to the mainland. The Channel Islands of California are one such place. Even when sea levels were lowest, deep water separated these islands from the coast. People could only reach them by using boats. Excavations on the Channel Islands revealed tools dating back over 13,000 years. The tools were specialized for marine life. Archaeologists found fish hooks made of shell and bone. They found stone points designed for hunting sea mammals. The animal bones in the campfires belonged to deep-water fish. These fish species lived far from the shore. Catching them required fishermen to paddle into deep water. The island residents did not just visit the coast. They lived on the water. Further inland, other sites show early occupation. In Oregon, researchers examined the Paisley Caves. They found ancient human waste material. This material is called coprolites. The dry cave air preserved these remains for 14,000 years. To determine the age of these remains, scientists used accelerator mass spectrometry. This process measures the decay of carbon-14. Living plants and animals absorb carbon from the atmosphere. Most of this carbon is carbon-12, which is stable. A small fraction is carbon-14, which is radioactive. When an organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon. The carbon-14 inside it begins to decay at a predictable rate. The atoms turn into nitrogen-14 over time. Scientists take a tiny sample of the ancient material. They clean the sample to remove modern contaminants. They burn the sample to turn it into carbon dioxide gas. This gas is then converted into solid graphite. The graphite is placed inside the accelerator. The machine ionizes the carbon atoms and accelerates them to high speeds. Magnets bend the path of the atoms. The lighter carbon-12 atoms bend more easily than the heavier carbon-14 atoms. Detectors count the exact number of each atom type. By comparing the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14, scientists calculate how long ago the organism died. The Paisley Caves samples contained genetic material from fish and wetland plants. The residents ate food from local marshes and rivers. They knew the interior landscape well. This shows they were not new arrivals. They had lived in the region long enough to understand its resources. In Chile, the site of Huaca Prieta contains ancient fishing gear. Archaeologists found nets made of plant fibers. To make these nets, workers harvested wild reeds. They soaked the stalks in water to soften the outer skin. They split the stalks into thin, flexible threads. They twisted these threads together to make strong cordage. They tied the cordage using square knots. These knots did not slip when the net became wet. They attached grooved stones to the bottom of the nets to act as weights. They attached light wood to the top as floats. These artifacts date back 14,500 years. This age matches the timeline of the coastal migration. Modern genetic science provides more clues. Scientists compare the DNA of living Native Americans with DNA from ancient skeletons. The results show a complex history. The genetic diversity is too wide for a single migration event. Instead, the data points to multiple groups entering the Americas at different times. The first major genetic wave occurred between 20,000 and 25,000 years ago. This group moved south from Beringia. Their descendants populated both North and South America. Later, other groups arrived. The Na-Dene speakers arrived approximately 12,000 years ago. Their descendants settled in the northwest parts of the continent. The Inuit and Aleut peoples arrived in a separate wave about 5,000 years ago. They settled in the far northern regions. Each group adapted to their environment. In Beringia, people lived for thousands of years before moving south. Beringia was a wide land bridge between Asia and Alaska. It was not a narrow strip of land. The land bridge was over 1,600 kilometers wide. The region had its own climate and vegetation. Low shrubs and grasses grew across the plains. Large mammals grazed on the vegetation. Humans lived in this region during the coldest parts of the Ice Age. They were isolated from Asia and from the rest of North America. During this isolation, their genetics changed. They developed unique genetic markers. When the ice sheets began to melt, some groups moved south along the coast. Others waited for the interior path to open. To survive in the treeless landscape of Beringia, people developed specialized survival techniques. They burned bones for fuel. Dry bones contain fat and marrow. When heated, the fats inside the bone melt and burn like oil. People stacked dried mammoth bones in their hearths. They lit small twigs to start the fire. The heat melted the fats inside the large bones. The fat fed the flames for hours. This allowed people to cook and stay warm. Geneticists also study ancient skeletons to trace these roots. In Brazil, researchers found a skeleton named Luzia. The bones were 11,500 years old. The skull shape differed from modern Native American populations. The features resembled populations from Australia and southern Asia. This difference suggested that early migrations included diverse groups of people. The skeleton was stored in the National Museum of Brazil. In 2018, a fire destroyed the museum. The fire consumed many ancient specimens. Although the physical bones were lost, the genetic data survived in scientific records. The new evidence changes the historical timeline. The idea of a single group of hunters walking through an ice corridor is no longer sufficient. The population of the Americas involved multiple groups of people. They used boats to travel along the coast. They walked through valleys when the ice receded. They settled in the forests, the deserts, and the plains. This migration took place over thousands of years. The ancestral lineages of the Americas began to diverge and spread into every ecological niche of the two vast continents. They walked through valleys when the ice receded. They settled in the forests, the deserts, and the plains. This migration took place over thousands of years. Modern genetic studies reveal that these early populations did not move in a single, unidirectional wave. Instead, groups separated, reunited, and interacted over thousands of kilometers. This genomic ledger shows that the deep history of these continents is as ancient and complex as that of any other region on Earth. Archaeologists are finding new sites that push the timeline of human occupation further back into the Pleistocene epoch. Researchers are using underwater archaeology to locate submerged settlements along the ancient coastlines. Rising sea levels drowned these coastal camps at the end of the last ice age, leaving them preserved in cold, low-oxygen marine environments. Specialist divers use side-scan sonar and core sampling to locate stone tools and hearth remains under 30 meters of ocean water. Genetic analysis has become precise enough to track how small family groups split off and later reunited. These ancient people were skilled navigators who adapted to rapid environmental changes. They crossed thousands of kilometers of varied terrain, leaving physical markers that researchers are only now learning to identify. By 15,000 years ago, human communities lived in almost every corner of North and South America. They developed specialized tools for hunting, fishing, and gathering local plants. As populations grew, these groups established permanent villages and constructed complex trade networks. Over several centuries, these networks facilitated the exchange of goods, raw materials, and ideas across vast distances. Some of these societies eventually built large urban centers that rivaled the major cities of Europe and Asia. When European explorers arrived in the 16th century, they did not encounter an untouched wilderness. They found organized states, extensive agricultural systems, and large cities. Many of these cities had already flourished, declined, and been abandoned long before the first European ships arrived. largest of these pre-Columbian urban centers was Cahokia, located in the fertile floodplain of the Mississippi River. Around the year 1250, while construction workers in England were laying the foundations for Westminster Abbey, Cahokia was a bustling metropolis. The city occupied a strategic position near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. This location allowed the residents to control river trade routes that stretched across North America. Between 10,000 and 40,000 people lived in the city and its surrounding suburbs. Even the lower estimate makes Cahokia larger than contemporary London, which housed about 15,000 residents. A visitor approaching the city would first notice a massive earthen structure rising from the flat plain. This structure is Monk's Mound, a flat-topped pyramid that stands over 30 meters high. The base of the mound covers more than 5 hectares of land, making it larger at its foundation than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The construction of Monk's Mound required a massive, coordinated labor force, working over several generations. Workers did not use draft animals or wheeled vehicles to transport the soil. Instead, they excavated earth from nearby borrow pits using wooden spades and stone hoes. They loaded the soil into woven baskets made from split cane or willow branches. A single basket of wet clay could weigh up to 25 kilograms. Laborers carried these heavy baskets on their backs, using forehead straps called tump lines to distribute the weight. They walked up wooden ramps to deposit the soil on the growing mound. To prevent the massive structure from sliding during heavy rains, the builders used a specific engineering technique. They layered different types of soil, alternating between porous sand and dense clay. The clay layers acted as a barrier to water, preventing it from soaking deep into the core of the mound. The sand layers allowed excess water to drain away from the sides, maintaining the structural integrity of the pyramid. At the summit of Monk's Mound stood a large building, which likely served as a temple or the residence of a ruler. From this height, the city leaders could look down upon a grid of smaller mounds, plazas, and residential zones. The city planners laid out the streets on a precise grid oriented to the cardinal directions. Most European cities of the same era grew organically, resulting in narrow, winding streets. Cahokia was planned from its inception, with distinct residential neighborhoods, ceremonial spaces, and agricultural zones. The houses in Cahokia were sturdy rectangular structures, built using a method known as wall trench construction. To build a house, workers dug deep trenches into the clay subsoil to outline the walls. They placed vertical wooden posts into these trenches, then packed the dirt back around them to secure the frame. The builders wove flexible saplings between the vertical posts to create a sturdy lattice, a technique known as wattle. They covered this lattice with a thick mixture of wet clay, grass, and straw called daub. When dry, this plaster sealed the walls against wind and rain. The roof was made of bundles of prairie grass thatch tied to a wooden framework. This design provided excellent insulation, keeping the interior cool in the summer and warm during the cold Illinois winters. On the western edge of the city stood several circular arrangements of large cedar posts, known today as wood henges. The residents used these wooden circles as astronomical observatories to track the movements of the sun. The posts were positioned so that, when viewed from the center of the circle, the sun rose directly behind specific markers on the solstices and equinoxes. To determine the exact dates of the agricultural calendar, priests used the alignment of the shadow cast by the central post. On the morning of the spring equinox, the sun rose directly in line with a post that pointed toward Monk's Mound. This alignment marked the beginning of the planting season, signaling that it was time to prepare the soil for maize. The observations allowed the community to coordinate their planting schedules, ensuring that crops were sown after the last frost. A large, artificially leveled plaza stood at the center of the city, covering about 20 hectares. This plaza was used for public gatherings, market days, and competitive games. The most popular sport was chunky, a game played by rolling a polished stone disc across the clay floor of the plaza. The players used a specially prepared stone disc, often carved from quartz or granite, which was polished until it was smooth. One player rolled the disc across the flat plaza with great force. As the stone rolled, two players ran alongside it, throwing wooden spears tipped with blunt ends. The goal was to land the spear as close as possible to the spot where the stone would finally stop rolling. Players had to calculate the speed of the disc and the wind resistance on their spears. The game required immense physical skill and coordination. Spectators placed large bets on the outcomes of these matches, sometimes wagering personal possessions or agricultural surplus. The air in Cahokia was filled with the sounds of tool-making, pottery production, and trade negotiations. The city was the hub of a trade network that covered thousands of kilometers. Archaeologists have found copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains in the ruins. Artisans worked these raw materials into ornaments, weapons, and status symbols for the elite. By the year 1400, the grand city of Cahokia was completely abandoned. The population left the region, leaving behind the massive mounds and empty plazas. There is no evidence of a sudden military invasion or a catastrophic fire that destroyed the city. Instead, researchers believe that a combination of environmental changes and social instability led to the decline of the city. A prolonged period of drought in the 14th century likely reduced crop yields, making it difficult to support such a large population. High population density in the urban center created significant waste management problems. The accumulation of refuse in the common areas likely contaminated the local water supply. This contamination would have allowed waterborne pathogens to spread rapidly through the residential quarters. Some archaeologists suggest that the residents chose to leave the centralized hierarchy of the city. These families may have preferred the autonomy of smaller, decentralized villages, where decisions were made by consensus. The archaeological record shows that the population did not disappear from the region, but rather established smaller farmsteads along the river valleys. Further to the southwest, another society developed in the arid lands of the San Juan Basin. The people of this region constructed large stone settlements during the period when European towns were recovering from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. In Chaco Canyon, located in modern New Mexico, builders established a regional center that influenced communities across a wide area. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, the inhabitants constructed several massive residential blocks known as great houses. The largest of these structures was Pueblo Bonito, a semicircular complex that rose to 5 stories in some sections. To build these structures, stonemasons developed a method of core and veneer masonry. Workers first built a rough central core of irregular stones bound together with thick clay mortar. Once this core was stable, they faced the exterior walls with carefully selected thin tablets of sandstone. The masons laid these facing stones in alternating bands of thick and thin courses, creating a smooth surface that distributed the weight of the upper stories. This technique allowed the walls to reach a thickness of 1 meter at the base, which supported the pressure of the timber ceilings above. The builders aligned the primary walls of Pueblo Bonito with specific astronomical events. The straight southern wall of the complex runs precisely east to west, marking the path of the sun during the equinoxes. At midday on these dates, the sun aligns with the main doorways, casting no shadows on the interior jambs. The rooms also contain small, high windows designed to admit sunlight only during the winter solstice. This precision required generations of observation to record the movements of the sun and the moon against the canyon horizon. Within these complexes, the builders excavated circular subterranean chambers called kivas. A typical kiva functioned as a ceremonial chamber and a social gathering space for the lineage groups. The construction of a kiva involved digging a circular pit, lining the walls with stone masonry, and building a timber roof supported by stone pilasters. A small fire pit occupied the center of the floor, ventilated by a fresh air shaft that tunneled through the outer wall. A deflector stone stood between the shaft opening and the fire to prevent drafts from blowing ashes into the room. The construction of these great houses required vast quantities of timber for the roof supports. The builders used ponderosa pine and Douglas fir logs to span the wide rooms, serving as primary beams. Because Chaco Canyon lacked local forests, work parties traveled to mountain ranges 50 kilometers away to harvest the trees. Laborers felled the trees using stone axes, stripped the bark, and carried the heavy logs across the desert. The workers carried these timbers on their shoulders, as they did not use draft animals or wheeled transport. The inhabitants also constructed a network of wide roads that radiated from the canyon. These roads measured up to 9 meters in width and ran in straight lines across the undulating desert floor. When a road encountered a steep cliff face, the builders did not divert the path around the obstacle. Instead, they carved steep staircases directly into the sandstone rock to maintain the straight alignment of the route. Further north, in the plateau country of Colorado, another group of builders adapted their architecture to the sandstone cliffs. Between the late 12th and 13th centuries, these people constructed villages inside deep alcoves in the canyon walls. The largest of these settlements, known as Cliff Palace, contained over 150 rooms built under a massive rock overhang. The overhanging cliff protected the dry masonry walls from rain and snow, preserving the wooden roof beams from rot. To build these cliff dwellings, workers transported materials up steep rock faces using hand and toe holds pecked into the sandstone. The masons shaped sandstone blocks using harder river cobbles as hammers, dressing the faces of the stones until they fit tightly. They used a mortar made of sand, clay, and water to seal the joints between the courses. To conserve water in the dry environment, the builders recycled gray water from cooking and washing to mix the mortar. The positioning of the alcoves provided natural temperature regulation for the inhabitants. During the winter, the low angle of the sun allowed sunlight to penetrate deep into the alcove, warming the stone walls. In the summer, the high cliff overhang shaded the buildings from the midday heat, keeping the rooms cool. The residents grew maize, beans, and squash on the flat mesa tops above the cliffs, carrying the harvest down via the steep footholds. By the end of the 13th century, the inhabitants abandoned the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. Tree ring data indicates that a severe drought affected the region for over 2 decades during this period. The lack of winter snowfall reduced the spring runoff, drying up the springs that supplied the villages with drinking water. The population migrated southward, joining other communities along the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado River. Further south, in the desert of Arizona, the Hohokam people managed their water resources through large-scale engineering. They constructed over 800 kilometers of irrigation canals to divert water from the Salt and Gila rivers to their fields. The engineers dug these canals with a precise gradient, sloping downhill at a rate of 1 meter per kilometer. This gradient allowed the water to flow slow enough to prevent erosion of the canal banks, but fast enough to prevent silt from settling and blocking the channel. To control the water flow, the Hohokam built wooden headgates at the mouth of each canal. These gates consisted of woven brush mats held in place by wooden posts driven into the riverbed. By raising or lowering the mats, operators regulated the volume of water entering the agricultural fields. The system supported large settlements in the desert for centuries, and modern canal systems in the region still follow the alignments established by these early engineers. Farmers in the Amazon basin noticed that certain patches of ground produced abundant crops, while the surrounding clay remained yellow and barren. The local people called this dark earth terra preta, and they sought it out for planting maize and manioc. Rain in the tropical forest normally washes nutrients out of the topsoil within a few seasons of clearing. This specific black soil, however, retained its dark color and high crop yields for decades without rest. Chemical analysis of the soil revealed high concentrations of charcoal, animal bones, fish scales, and decomposed plant matter. The creation of this soil required a deliberate process of low-temperature smoldering. People gathered agricultural waste and green wood into piles, covering them with a thin layer of damp earth to restrict oxygen. They lit the wood, allowing it to char slowly rather than burn to ash. This process produced biochar, a highly porous form of charcoal that resists decay for thousands of years. The microscopic pores in the charcoal acted as sponges, retaining water and preventing soluble nutrients from washing away in heavy rains. Workers mixed this charcoal into the clay soil along with household refuse and manure. Over generations, this mixture developed a stable structure that supported dense colonies of beneficial microorganisms. These engineered plots were not isolated gardens. Archaeologists found patches of terra preta throughout the Amazon basin, covering vast areas that in total equaled the size of a European nation. The placement of these soils coincided with high concentrations of specific tree species that provided food and materials. People planted Brazil nut trees, cupuaçu, and various palms in the enriched soil, gradually transforming the forest composition. They carried seeds and saplings over long distances, weeding out unproductive species to favor trees that yielded fruit, fiber, and wood. This selective planting altered the canopy over centuries, turning the forest into a managed orchard. The high density of these useful trees shows that the region was a human-modified landscape rather than an untouched wilderness. In the temperate forests of North America, people altered the landscape by moving vast quantities of earth to form precise geometric shapes. Along a high ridge overlooking Brush Creek in southern Ohio, builders constructed a massive earthen embankment shaped like a winding serpent. The embankment measured over 400 meters in length, with a height of 1 meter and a width of 6 meters at the center. The builders began by clearing the forest floor down to the yellow clay subsoil, removing all organic matter. They then laid down a foundation of local stones and clay to prevent the structure from sliding down the steep cliffside. To shape the body of the serpent, workers carried clay and topsoil in woven baskets from nearby borrow pits. Each basket held about 20 kilograms of earth, requiring tens of thousands of individual trips to complete the structure. The workers dumped the soil in overlapping piles, packing it down with their feet and wooden tamps to prevent erosion. The serpent body curved in 7 distinct coils, terminating in a triple coil at the tail. The head of the serpent pointed toward the cliff edge, aligned with the sunset on the summer solstice. The builders used sighting sticks and horizon markers to establish this alignment before placing the first basket of earth. Further south in the Ohio River Valley, the Hopewell people constructed large geometric enclosures using similar earth-moving techniques. They designed circular, square, and octagonal embankments that enclosed areas of up to 40 hectares. To lay out these shapes, surveyors used hemp cords of fixed lengths pinned to the ground with wooden stakes. They swept these cords in arcs to create perfect circles and used intersecting lines to establish right angles for the squares. The embankments connected to one another through parallel earthen walls that formed wide avenues. One such roadway extended 96 kilometers, linking the ceremonial complex at Newark with the mounds near Chillicothe. The construction of these roadways required a cleared path through the forest, with ditches dug on either side to drain rainwater. The builders graded the surface, filling in low spots and cutting through small ridges to maintain a level pathway. They lined the edges of the road with low earthen embankments, creating a defined corridor that stayed dry during spring floods. This infrastructure allowed travelers to move between distant ceremonial sites without navigating the dense undergrowth of the river valleys. The scale of these projects indicates a coordinated effort by multiple communities who shared engineering standards and astronomical knowledge. In the arid basin of the Salt and Gila rivers, the Hohokam people engineered a different kind of infrastructure to divert water to their crops. The region received less than 20 centimeters of rain per year, making agriculture impossible without artificial irrigation. To tap the rivers, workers dug main canals that diverted water miles upstream from their fields. They began by constructing low diversion domains made of woven willow branches and heavy stones placed across the river channel. These dams did not stop the river, but instead raised the water level just enough to force a portion of the flow into the canal mouth. The design of the canals required precise control of the water's gradient. If the slope was too steep, the rushing water would erode the clay banks and destroy the canal. If the slope was too gentle, the water would silt up and stop flowing, leaving the crops dry. The engineers maintained a consistent gradient of about 1 meter of drop per kilometer of distance. They achieved this by using shallow bowls filled with water to judge the levelness of the terrain before digging. The workers used digging sticks made of sharpened ironwood to loosen the compacted desert soil. They shuttered the loose dirt into baskets using large bivalve shells gathered from the Gulf of California. The main canals measured up to 9 meters wide and 3 meters deep near the river intake. As the canals extended further into the valley, they branched into smaller distribution channels called laterals. The Hohokam controlled the flow at these junctions using simple wooden gates and earth dams. To divert water into a specific lateral, a farmer placed a woven mat or a wooden plank across the main channel, forcing the water to back up and flow into the smaller ditch. The interior of the canals became lined with a thick layer of fine silt over time, which sealed the porous, sandy soil and prevented water from leaking into the ground. The maintenance of this canal system required constant labor to clear sediment and repair damage after seasonal floods. Heavy rains in the mountains could send a torrent of water down the river, threatening to wash away the diversion dams and silt up the canal mouths. When the flow subsided, communities worked together to scoop out the accumulated mud and rebuild the brush dams. This coordinated effort sustained agricultural communities in the desert for over 1,000 years. European settlers who arrived in the 19th century recognized the efficiency of this layout and cleared the ancient channels to use them for their own crops. The dark earth of the Amazon basin required constant additions of charcoal, bone, and green manure to maintain its fertility. A family would pile agricultural waste in shallow pits, cover it with damp earth, and burn it slowly with minimal oxygen to produce porous biochar. This carbon structure acted like a sponge, absorbing nutrients and hosting beneficial microbes. When the caretakers died, this process of soil enrichment stopped. Without the regular application of fresh organic matter, the natural tropical rains began to leach nutrients from the topsoil. The wild vegetation returned within decades, covering the managed orchards of Brazil nut and palm trees. To the eyes of European observers, these overgrown areas appeared to be untouched tropical forests. The earthen structures of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys deteriorated through different processes. Settlers viewed the geometric embankments as barriers to their wooden plows. Farmers systematically leveled the circular and square enclosures to create flat wheat fields. In other regions, treasure hunters dug deep trenches into the centers of burial mounds, collapsing the internal timber chambers. The rain then washed the loosened clay down the sides, reducing sharp geometric ridges to low, rounded hillocks. In the dry valleys of the American Southwest, the Hohokam irrigation systems failed rapidly without manual labor. The main diversion dams across the Salt River were constructed of woven brushwood and heavy river boulders. Every summer, flood damaged these barriers, requiring immediate repairs with fresh willow branches and stone fill. When the engineers perished, the floods tore wide gaps in the dams. The river water could no longer enter the canal inlets. Silt settled in the quiet waters of the main channels, filling them to the brim within a few seasons. The fields of corn, squash, and cotton dried under the desert sun, and the native creosote bushes reclaimed the flatlands. During the 17th century, European colonists traveled inland from the Atlantic coast. They reported vast forests that seemed to have no history of human habitation. The empty grasslands of the interior supported only scattered groups of hunters who moved with the seasons. Writers in London and Paris used these descriptions to argue that the land was theirs to claim. They assumed the continents had always been quiet. This conclusion ignored the massive loss of life that had occurred just before their arrival. For several decades, researchers debated the number of people living in the Americas in the year 1492. Mid-century historians estimated the total population at fewer than 10 million. This figure matched the colonial narrative of an empty continent. Later, archaeologists began to map the physical remains of settlements. They counted thousands of house basins, extensive networks of agricultural terraces, and massive heaps of discarded shells. The evidence forced a revision of the old estimates. Some researchers calculated that 40 million people lived in the Americas, while others suggested 80 million. This high population density made the sudden disappearance of these societies difficult to explain. The explanation lay in the introduction of microscopic pathogens. When the first Spanish sailors landed in the Caribbean, they carried viruses in their respiratory tracts and on their clothing. The native inhabitants had lived in isolation from these specific diseases for 15,000 years. Their bodies lacked the antibodies that Europeans had developed over centuries of exposure to domestic animals. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread through the coastal villages within days of contact. The pathogens traveled faster than the European explorers themselves. Trading parties carried the infections along river routes long before any foreign soldier arrived. A merchant carrying obsidian or shells would feel healthy when he left a village, only to develop a fever days later at a distant market. In this manner, the smallpox virus moved from the Gulf Coast deep into the interior of the continent. Entire families died in their homes, leaving no one to bury the dead or tend the crops. When the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto marched through the southeastern forests in the year 1539, he recorded large town squares surrounded by defensive palisades. The leaders of these chiefdoms controlled storehouses filled with maize and smoked meats. By the time French travelers reached the Mississippi River a century and a half later, these large towns were empty mounds of earth. The survivors had grouped themselves into smaller, mobile bands to survive. Diseases carried by the first European explorers spread faster than the travelers themselves, moving inland along established trade routes. These pathogens encountered populations that possessed no acquired immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, or typhus. In human immunology, when a new pathogen enters a population with zero prior exposure, it causes what epidemiologists call a virgin soil epidemic. The human immune system relies on white blood cells called lymphocytes, which produce specific proteins called antibodies to neutralize foreign invaders. When an individual survives an infection, some of these lymphocytes persist as memory cells, allowing the body to mount a rapid defense if the pathogen returns. Without this immunological memory, the virus or bacterium multiplies unchecked within the host, leading to high mortality rates across all age groups simultaneously. The resulting mortality rate frequently reached 90% within 2 generations. This scale of loss meant that standard social functions collapsed immediately, as there were not enough healthy people to bury the dead or tend the sick. In many settlements, every person over the age of 5 died, leaving only small children who could not yet feed themselves or recall the traditions of their community. In other places, the only survivors were individuals who happened to be away on hunting trips or trading expeditions when the pathogen arrived. When they returned, they found their villages silent and filled with decomposing bodies. As the population collapsed, specialized knowledge vanished because the experts died before they could train successors. Oral historians who kept the genealogies and treaty records of entire confederacies died without passing on their narratives. Priests who tracked the cycles of Venus and the moon to regulate the agricultural calendar perished, leaving no one to determine the proper dates for planting. Healers who understood the complicated preparation of herbal remedies died, taking their pharmacopoeia with them. Master potters, weavers, and metal workers died without teaching their apprentices the precise temperatures needed to fire clay or temper copper. Without human labor, the managed landscapes of the Americas transformed rapidly. The open, park-like forests that early travelers had noted began to fill with dense undergrowth. Indigenous forestry relied on regular, controlled burns, a method that cleared leaf litter and prevented destructive canopy fires. To conduct a controlled burn, workers chose cool, damp days in the early spring or late autumn, when the wind was steady but light. They set fires along the perimeter of a designated plot, using torches made of resinous pine or tightly bound bark. The fire crept slowly against the wind, consuming the dry leaves, fallen twigs, and small saplings, while leaving the thick bark of mature oak, chestnut, and hickory trees undamaged. This process returned nutrients like potassium and phosphorus to the soil in the form of ash, stimulating the growth of berry bushes and native grasses that attracted deer and elk. When the people who managed these burns died, the forest floor accumulated dry wood. Wildfires ignited by lightning burned hot enough to destroy the forest canopy, and shade-tolerant species crowded out the food-bearing trees. Within 40 years, the clear forests became thick, tangled woods that Europeans later mistook for untouched wilderness. Agricultural infrastructure decayed with equal speed. On the hillsides, stone-walled terraces that had prevented soil erosion for centuries began to fail. These terraces required constant maintenance, as heavy rains washed silt into the flat planting areas and loosened the mortarless stone retaining walls. Once a single section of a terrace wall collapsed, water channeled through the gap, carving deep gullies and washing away the rich topsoil. Irrigation canals that directed water from mountain streams to lowland fields filled with sand and organic debris. Without seasonal dredging, the water breached the canal banks, turning fertile fields into stagnant swamps where mosquitoes bred, further spreading disease. This ecological collapse created the illusion of an empty continent. When later waves of European settlers arrived, they did not see the active farms and managed orchards that had existed a century earlier. Instead, they observed a landscape that appeared wild, populated by small, scattered groups of people who seemed to live simple lives. The settlers assumed this was the natural state of the Americas, unaware that they were looking at the ruins of a collapsed civilization. Some early explorers did witness the continent before the depopulation reached its peak. In the year 1524, the Italian navigator Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed along the Atlantic coast of North America. Near the area of modern North Carolina, Verrazzano observed wide fields of maize stretching inland for several miles, free of trees and weeds. He wrote of forests so open that a horseman could ride through them without difficulty, and he noted that the air was frequently smoky from the numerous cooking and clearing fires of coastal villages. Nearly a century later, when French explorers entered the Great Lakes region, they still found rivers teeming with fish that had been managed through complex weir systems. A fish weir consisted of rows of wooden stakes driven into the riverbed, woven together with flexible willow branches to form a V-shaped barrier. The wide end of the V pointed upstream, directing migrating fish down toward a narrow opening at the point. Here, fishermen placed woven baskets or stood with dip nets to harvest the catch. This method allowed communities to capture large quantities of fish while letting younger fish pass through the gaps in the willow fencing, preserving the breeding population. By the time the English passengers of the Mayflower landed at Plymouth in the year 1620, the local population had already been devastated. The site they selected for their colony was the Wampanoag village of Patuxet, which had been abandoned 4 years earlier after a disease swept through the coastal region. The colonists found cleared fields ready for planting, along with overgrown storage pits that still contained baskets of corn. They built their homes directly on the sites of Wampanoag dwellings, using the cleared land to survive their first winter. The settlers did not realize that the empty fields were the result of a local apocalypse. For the survivors, the loss required a drastic triage of their own culture. With the death of so many elders, communities had to decide which ceremonies, stories, and technologies were essential to preserve. Some languages disappeared entirely because the remaining speakers were too few to maintain them in daily use. Political structures disintegrated as hereditary leaders died without heirs, forcing different ethnic and linguistic groups to merge for survival. The survivors combined their remaining knowledge, creating new traditions and alliances to adapt to the changed world. Benjamin Franklin sat in the meeting hall at Albany, New York, in the summer of 1754, attempting to persuade representatives from 6 British colonies to form a unified defensive alliance against French forces. He presented a written proposal for a Grand Council, which he called the Albany Plan of Union. This proposal drew heavily from a political system that had operated across the region for 3 centuries. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy united 5 distinct nations under a written constitution that distributed authority through a series of checks and balances. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations had established a method to preserve the sovereignty of individual communities while maintaining a unified front for foreign affairs. This system was governed by the Great Law of Peace, known as the Gaya-Nashagoa. The Constitution of the Haudenosaunee operated through structured procedures that prevented any single group from seizing absolute control. Each of the 5 nations managed its own villages and domestic resources without interference from the central government. When issues arose that affected the entire Confederacy, such as regional trade, foreign treaties, or military defense, representatives gathered at the Central Council Fire. 50 peace chiefs, known as sachems, held seats on this council. The distribution of seats was not based on population. The Onondaga Nation held 14 seats, the Cayuga held 10, the Mohawk and Oneida held 9 each, and the Seneca held 8. This unequal distribution prevented any single group from dominating the proceedings, because all decisions required absolute consensus. To reach consensus, the council followed a strict legislative process that functioned like a physical sorting mechanism. The 50 sachems were divided into 3 groups. The Mohawk and Seneca sat on one side of the council fire as the elder brothers, while the Oneida and Cayuga sat on the opposite side as the younger brothers. The Onondaga sat at the center as the keepers of the council fire. When a policy proposal was introduced, the elder brothers discussed it first. Once they reached agreement, they passed the proposal across the fire to the younger brothers. If the younger brothers agreed, the proposal went to the Onondaga, who confirmed that the decision aligned with the great law of peace. If any single sachem objected at any stage, the proposal was rejected and sent back to the individual clans for further debate. This legislative process relied on a physical assembly of council logs and firekeepers to regulate the debate. The firekeepers lit a central hearth using logs of white pine, which burned slowly and provided steady illumination. The sachems sat on wooden benches arranged in a circle around the hearth. To speak, a sachem had to stand and hold a wampum belt, which served as a physical token of authority. A wampum belt was made from hundreds of small, cylindrical beads carved from the shells of the quahog clam and the whelk. The white beads represented peace, while the purple beads represented civic matters. Crafting these beads required drilling a fine hole through the center of each shell using a stone-tipped bow drill, then polishing the outer surface on a wet grindstone. The beads were woven together on buckskin thongs to form geometric patterns that recorded specific laws. The authority to appoint or dismiss these sachems rested with the women of the clans, specifically the senior women known as clan mothers. Each sachem represented a specific maternal lineage, and the clan mother of that lineage selected the individual who would hold the title. If a sachem failed to represent his people, ignored the consensus of the council, or acted in a tyrannical manner, the clan mother issued 3 warnings. If the sachem ignored the 3rd warning, the clan mother stripped him of his title in a process called dehorning, removing the deer antlers that symbolized his office. The clan mothers also maintained control over the food stores held in communal longhouses. This economic control gave them veto power over military campaigns, because warriors could not launch an expedition without the cornmeal and dried meat stored by the women. English and French observers struggled to comprehend this distribution of authority, as their own societies operated under monarchical structures. Benjamin Franklin, however, studied the Haudenosaunee system during treaty negotiations and incorporated its federalist structure into his Albany Plan of Union. His plan proposed that individual colonies retain their local assemblies while sending representatives to a grand council to manage defense and trade. Other colonial leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, also examined these indigenous systems of governance. Across North America, various native groups had developed distinct political structures that did not rely on absolute rulers or coercive police forces. In the Southeast, the Muskogee Creek Confederacy organized their towns into a dual system of governance designed to balance military action and civil peace. Each town was designated as either a red town or a white town. Red towns managed military affairs, defense, and external conflicts, led by war chiefs who earned their status through military success. White towns managed civil administration, diplomacy, agricultural festivals, and internal disputes, led by peace chiefs chosen for their wisdom and oratorical skill. During times of peace, the white towns held authority, but when the Confederacy declared war, leadership shifted to the red towns. This system prevented military leaders from seizing permanent political control during peacetime. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit and Haida peoples organized their societies around house groups, which functioned as corporate landholding entities. A house group consisted of several extended families living in a large cedar plank house, led by a house leader who managed the local resources. To build one of these structures, workers felled giant red cedars using stone adzes and wedges made of yew wood. They split the logs into flat planks, which they lashed to a heavy post and beam frame using cedar bark ropes. The front of the house was decorated with carved crests representing the history of the lineage. The leader of the house maintained authority by organizing potlatch ceremonies, where they distributed accumulated wealth such as copper shields, wool blankets, and preserved eulachon oil to rival leaders. The distribution of oil during a potlatch acted as a physical demonstration of resource management. Eulachon, also known as candlefish, are small, oily fish that run in coastal rivers. To extract the oil, workers piled tons of harvested fish into large wooden vats filled with water, then dropped heated stones into the vats to boil the mixture. As the oil floated to the surface, workers skimmed it off using cedar ladles and stored it in hollow kelp bulbs. At the potlatch, the host poured large quantities of this oil onto the central hearth fire, creating a sudden flare of light and heat that demonstrated the abundance of their resources. A leader who could afford to burn or give away such wealth secured their political standing, while those who could not match the gift-giving lost prestige and influence. Further east on the Great Plains, the Osage Nation divided their society into two complementary halves, known as moieties. One half represented the sky, while the other half represented the earth. Each moiety had specific roles in civil governance and religious ceremonies. A person was required to marry someone from the opposite moiety, which ensured that every family had relatives in both halves of the society. Political decisions required the unanimous agreement of two headmen, one representing the sky and one representing the earth. This dual leadership prevented either faction from enacting policies that would harm the other, as every family group had a direct stake in both sides of the government. European administrators frequently wrote letters expressing irritation at the refusal of indigenous leaders to command their people. These governors expected a single chief to sign a treaty and force an entire nation to obey its terms. The structure of native governance did not allow for this type of coercion. A leader maintained authority through the quality of their advice and their ability to build agreement among different factions. If a spokesperson signed an agreement that the community did not support, the community simply ignored the agreement. This consensus system relied on a specific diplomatic protocol to make decisions. When a proposal was made, the council members did not vote immediately. Instead, they broke into smaller groups based on kinship or clan lines. Each small group discussed the proposal in detail, seeking to find common ground. A speaker from each group then reported their collective thoughts back to the main assembly. If disagreements remained, the process repeated. This cycle of discussion could take days or weeks. No action was taken until every representative agreed to the compromise. This collaborative approach extended to the diplomatic networks that spanned the continent. Paths for runners connected the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. These routes allowed for the transport of physical goods over thousands of kilometers. Copper from the northern lakes moved south, while marine shells from the Gulf traveled north. This exchange was not a simple commercial transaction. It was a formal political alliance. The exchange of goods required a specific ceremony of hospitality to ensure safety. When travelers entered a new territory, they stopped at the border and waited for permission to proceed. Local hosts met the travelers and conducted a smoking ritual using a long-stemmed pipe. The host filled the pipe bowl with a mixture of dried leaves, often containing wild tobacco. The bowl was carved from soft red stone, and the wooden stem was wrapped in dyed porcupine quills. By inhaling the smoke and passing the pipe, both parties swore to maintain peace. This ritual created a legal fiction of family relationship between the strangers. Through these ceremonies, communities established rules for resolving disputes without violence. If a traveler killed a host, the killer's family had to pay a specific amount of goods to the victim's family. This payment, often made in valuable shells or furs, restored the balance between the groups. The system functioned as a framework of international law long before European legal theories reached the continent. European observers systematically downplayed these complex systems to justify the seizure of land. Writers described native societies as lawless and disorganized. They ignored the fact that these societies maintained order without prisons or standing armies. The political power of clan mothers was omitted from official reports. This omission allowed colonial powers to negotiate exclusively with men who were more easily manipulated or coerced. The sophisticated alliances were rewritten as mere trading paths. Astronomical observations were integrated into the daily life of communities across the continent. At Cahokia, specialists monitored the horizon from a central wooden post. They observed the point where the sun rose each morning against a circle of red cedar pillars. The cedar wood was chosen for its resistance to decay. The builders dug deep pits to set these heavy posts upright. To ensure the posts remained stable in the clay soil, the builders used a specific ramp construction method. They dug a sloping trench that met the vertical post hole at a sharp angle. The workers slid the heavy cedar log down the ramp until the base hit the bottom of the pit. They then used ropes braided from hickory bark to pull the log upright. Once the post was vertical, workers packed the empty space with clay and river stones. The alignment of these posts allowed the observer to predict the exact morning of the summer solstice. In the arid southwest, observers used petroglyphs to track the solar cycle. They selected a rock face that was shielded by 3 large stone slabs. These slabs were positioned naturally to cast a shadow on the cliff behind them. The observers carved a spiral design into the sandstone cliff face. As the sun moved through the sky, the gap between the stone slabs allowed a narrow beam of light to fall on the spiral. On the summer solstice, this light dagger pierced the exact center of the spiral. On the winter solstice, 2 separate beams of light bracketed the outer edges of the carving. Further south, Mayan astronomers recorded these cycles using a system of 3 interlocking calendars. The first was a ritual calendar of 260 days. This cycle ran parallel to a solar calendar of 365 days. The solar calendar consisted of 18 months, with each month lasting 20 days. To complete the year, the astronomers added 5 nameless days at the end of the cycle. These 2 calendars aligned perfectly only once every 18,980 days, a period of approximately 52 years. This cycle allowed the society to plan agricultural tasks and religious festivals with mathematical certainty. Medical knowledge was developed through systematic experimentation with the local flora. Healers identified specific plants to treat pain, infections, and digestive ailments. They passed this knowledge down through oral lineages, teaching apprentices how to identify, harvest, and prepare each remedy. To treat pain and reduce fever, healers harvested the bark of the willow tree. They did not strip the bark from the entire trunk, which would kill the tree. Instead, they removed narrow strips from young branches. The bark contains salicin, a compound that the human body converts into salicylic acid. The healer dried the bark and ground it into a fine powder. They then brewed this powder in hot water to create a bitter tea. This remedy was the direct predecessor to modern aspirin. In South America, healers used the bark of the cinchona tree to treat fevers. The active compound in this bark, later named quinine, interfered with the reproduction of Malaria asbestos in the blood. The preparation required stripping the bark, drying it in the sun, and grinding it to a powder. The powder was mixed with sweetened water to make the bitter taste tolerable. This treatment saved countless lives long before the mechanism of malaria was understood by Western science. Curare was prepared by boiling the bark of Strychnos toxifera vines for many hours. The hunter scraped the inner bark of the plant, placed the shavings in a funnel made of palm leaves, and trickled water through the fibers. This process extracted the active alkaloids, which were then boiled down to a thick, dark paste. The paste was smeared onto the tips of blowpipe darts. When the dart entered the bloodstream of a monkey, the active chemical blocked the signals between nerves and muscles. The prey lost the ability to move and fell from the canopy. Western surgeons later isolated these active agents to develop modern muscle relaxants. Tobacco was managed with similar precision. Healers collected the leaves of Nicotiana rustica, dried them in shade, and rolled them into tight bundles. The leaves contained high concentrations of nicotine, which acted as a powerful stimulant and hallucinogen when smoked in small, controlled doses during council meetings. The smoke was inhaled to induce altered states of consciousness, allowing leaders to deliberate without personal bias. Apprentices spent decades studying under established healers. The student learned to identify plants by the texture of their leaves, the smell of their crushed roots, and the time of year they flowered. A student began by carrying the healer's woven gathering baskets. They graduated to preparing basic poultices and finally learned the complex vocal patterns of the healing songs. The Cherokee and Navajo maintained these traditions through lineages of trained practitioners. When European travelers encountered these cures, they recorded the plant names in Latin. They published these findings in printed books, while the names of the original practitioners were omitted from the pages. The administration of these societies relied on complex counting systems. In the Andes, the Inca used the quipu, a device made of cotton or camelid cords. To construct a quipu, a maker took a thick primary cord and attached numerous thinner pendant strings to it. The maker tied knots along these pendant strings to represent specific values. A single knot represented the number 1, a long knot represented numbers from 2 to 9, and a figure 8 knot acted as a placeholder. The distance of the knot from the primary cord indicated its decimal value, with units at the bottom, tens above them, and hundreds closer to the top. The color of the thread indicated the category of the item being counted. A yellow thread represented gold, a red thread stood for soldiers, and a white thread indicated sheep. A trained reader could run their fingers over the knots to determine the exact tax obligations of a province. Further north, Maya scribes used a vigesimal system based on the number 20. This system used 3 basic symbols: a shell for 0, a dot for 1, and a bar for 5. Scribes wrote these symbols vertically, with the lowest values at the bottom of the column. Each level upward multiplied the value by 20. To write the number 20, a scribe placed a single dot on the second level and a shell symbol on the bottom level. Using this system, mathematicians calculated solar years, lunar cycles, and the movements of Venus. They carved these calculations into stone pillars to record the accessions of kings. Knowledge was preserved in structured narratives. The Haida of the northwest coast organized their histories into song cycles. These songs detailed the ownership of specific rivers and beachheads. A singer had to repeat the verses exactly as they had learned them from their maternal uncles. If a performer made an error, elder listeners stopped the performance to correct the mistake. The song served as a legal deed, describing how a specific ancestor had cleared a landing site for canoes or established a fish trap. In the Southwest, Dene singers memorized long ceremonial chants. These chants contained descriptions of symptoms, indicating which clay mixtures or root infusions could treat specific ailments. The verses also described the geography of the region, listing where springs flowed during dry seasons. Forest management relied on regular, low-intensity fire. In the southeastern pine forests, hunters used firebrands to ignite the dry undergrowth during the late autumn. The fire burned slowly through the dry needles and fallen twigs, but it did not reach the canopy of the mature pine trees. This process cleared the forest floor, allowing light to reach the soil. The fire stimulated the growth of wild grasses and berry bushes, which attracted white-tailed deer. The lack of accumulated wood prevented large, destructive fires from developing. In the Amazon basin, communities managed forests by planting useful species. They cleared small plots of forest, leaving Brazil nut and cacao trees standing. They planted manioc and fruit trees around these mature stands. Over generations, these clearings reverted to forest, but the composition of the trees remained altered. The resulting groves provided a reliable food source for centuries. In the Arctic, hunters monitored the sea ice. A hunter examined the color of the ice to determine its thickness. Dark, translucent ice indicated thin, newly formed sheets that could not support a sled. Light blue ice indicated thick, multi-year flows that were safe to cross. The hunter also listened to the sound of the ice cracking underfoot, using the pitch of the sound to estimate the pressure of the water below. This knowledge was disrupted by colonial policies. Missionaries established boarding schools where children were forbidden to speak their native languages. The students were punished for using the names of local plants or repeating the histories of their ancestors. Without a common language, elders could not pass their botanical knowledge to the younger generation. Many specialized vocabularies for plant identification and astronomy disappeared within 3 generations. Native military commanders operated within a framework of decentralized warfare that confounded European officers trained in linear tactics. A European battalion of the 17th century relied on the coordination of pike and musket in open fields. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder to maximize the density of their volley fire, a method that required flat ground and clear lines of sight. In the dense woodlands of the Northeast, such formations became targets rather than defensive walls. Native fighters utilized the natural topography as physical protection, dispersing into small, independent squads that communicated through imitative animal calls. This communication system allowed units to coordinate movements over several kilometers without revealing their positions. A scout mimicking the call of a crow could signal the approach of an enemy column, while another, replying with the cry of a blue jay, indicated the direction of retreat. These signals carried specific meanings regarding numbers, speed, and readiness. The physical training of a warrior began in childhood, focusing on silent movement over dry leaves and twigs. A runner learned to place the ball of the foot down first, feeling for obstructions before transferring weight, which prevented the snapping of dry wood. This technique allowed a war party to move through underbrush at a pace that matched a trotting horse on a cleared road. To counter these tactics, colonial commanders attempted to construct wooden stockades at regular intervals along river routes. These forts required vast amounts of timber, with oak or pine logs cut to 4 meters in height, sharpened at the points, and sunk 1 meter into the trench. The construction of a standard frontier outpost took 3 months of labor by 100-man details. Once completed, however, these structures remained isolated outposts in a landscape controlled by indigenous patrols. Native leaders routinely bypassed the fortified points to strike at the supply wagons that sustained them. A wagon train required 20 draft oxen to move 3 tons of flour and salt pork, traveling at less than 10 kilometers a day. By felling trees across the narrow wilderness tracks, small native units halted these convoys in areas where the forest pressed close to the road, neutralizing the protective fire of the escorting soldiers. Diplomacy between native confederacies and European colonial governments operated through strict ceremonial structures that governed speech, gift-giving, and the ratification of agreements. In the southeastern borderlands, the Muskogee leaders utilized a system of diplomatic hospitality centered on the shared consumption of the black drink, a highly caffeinated beverage brewed from the roasted leaves of the Yaupon holly. The preparation of this beverage was a precise ritual performed by designated officials. The leaves were parched in ceramic vessels over an open fire until they turned dark brown, then boiled in fresh water to extract a dark, bitter liquid. Serving this drink to visiting officials established a formal state of truce during which no participant could draw a weapon without violating the hospitality laws of the town. Following the purification ceremony, negotiations began through translators who translated European legal concepts into indigenous metaphorical language. Muskogee diplomats used physical objects to record and validate each stage of the debate. Red sticks indicated matters of defense or alliance in times of hostility, while white eagle feathers signified peace and trade agreements. A speaker held these objects while addressing the assembly, passing them to the opposing party once a specific point was agreed upon. The acceptance of the object by the European representative constituted a binding oath under native law, equivalent to a signed signature on parchment. European governors quickly learned that failure to distribute gifts at these councils resulted in the immediate suspension of trade. The exchange of goods was not a commercial transaction, but a physical manifestation of alliance. A governor who arrived without brass kettles, woolen blankets, and gunpowder was viewed as a leader without authority or wealth. The weight and quality of the wool in a trade blanket were measured by the recipients. A thin weave indicated a lack of respect or a failing treasury. By playing the British merchants of Charlestown against the Spanish authorities in St. Augustine, Muskogee leaders ensured a steady supply of high-grade trade goods at stable prices. They refused to grant exclusive trading monopolies to either nation, maintaining a competitive market that preserved their political independence. The introduction of the horse transformed the geopolitical landscape of the Great Plains, turning hunting societies into mobile military powers. The Spanish horse, derived from Andalusian stock, was uniquely suited to the semi-arid grasslands. These animals possessed compact hooves that resisted cracking in dry terrain, and they could subsist entirely on native grama grass without requiring grain supplements. The Comanche acquired these animals in the late 17th century and developed a culture centered on equestrian management. A single warrior maintained a herd of up to 30 horses, rotating them to prevent overgrazing around winter camps. Managing these large herds required a detailed understanding of grassland ecology. A horse requires approximately 25 liters of water and 10 kilograms of forage daily. In the winter, Comanche bands moved their camps to river valleys where cottonwood bark could be harvested to feed the horses when snow covered the pastures. The inner bark of the cottonwood was shaved using bone scrapers, providing a sweet, nutrient-rich feed that kept the horses strong until the spring grass emerged. This pastoral cycle allowed the Comanche to launch long-distance raids during the winter months, a season when Spanish garrison troops were confined to their quarters due to lack of forage. On the battlefield, Comanche riders developed a mounting technique that allowed them to use the body of the horse as a shield. By braiding a loop of horsehair into the mane, a rider could drop his body along the flank of the horse while riding at full gallop. From this position, the warrior could launch arrows from beneath the neck of the animal, presenting a target that was difficult for a musketeer to hit. The rate of fire from a short composite bow used on horseback was 10 arrows per minute, compared to the single shot per minute achievable with a Spanish flintlock musket. This mobility and fire superiority allowed the Comanche to extract tribute from Spanish settlements in New Mexico and Texas, dictating terms of trade and travel throughout the southern plain. In the Ohio River Valley, the Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, attempted to construct a unified political state that would span from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. The organizational framework of this alliance relied on a shared religious revival led by his brother, Tenskwatawa, who preached the rejection of all European manufactured goods. This religious component served as the unifying ideology that crossed linguistic barriers, uniting traditional enemies like the Wyandot, Delaware, and Potawatomi under a single political banner. The physical headquarters of this movement at Prophetstown became a center for diplomatic coordination, housing thousands of representatives from different nations. To coordinate this vast alliance, runners traveled thousands of kilometers carrying messages encoded in wampum belts and carved wooden sticks. A runner could cover 60 kilometers a day on foot, utilizing established trails that followed the ridges of the Appalachian chain. The messages delivered by these runners detailed the boundaries of the proposed Confederacy, which declared all land north of the Ohio River to be common property. Tecumseh argued that no single leader had the authority to sign away land through individual treaties, as the soil belonged to all indigenous people collectively. This legal doctrine challenged the treaty system used by the United States government, which relied on bribing minor chiefs to sign cessions of land. The American authorities recognized the threat posed by this unified front. Governor William Henry Harrison led an army toward Prophetstown, while Tecumseh was traveling south to recruit the Creek and Choctaw nations. The ensuing battle at the Tippecanoe River disrupted the alliance before it could fully coordinate its forces. The destruction of the town and the loss of winter food stores forced many of the Allied bands to disperse to their respective territories to avoid starvation. Although Tecumseh later allied with British forces during the War of 1812, the death of the Shawnee leader at the Battle of the Thames ended the prospect of an independent indigenous state in the Ohio Valley. Sitting Bull did not view the expansion of the United States as an inevitable wave that could not be resisted. The Lakota leader recognized that battlefield victories alone could not protect his people from the pressure of the American Republic. Instead of seeking military confrontation at every turn, Sitting Bull employed a strategy of persistent refusal. He refused to sign documents that ceded territory to the government in Washington, and he rejected the administration of reservations that offered inadequate resources. To maintain his independence, Sitting Bull led his followers across the northern border into Canada. The journey required navigating dry plains where water sources were scarce and buffalo herds were declining. Sitting Bull presented his case directly to British administrators, appealing to their sense of imperial law. By crossing this international line, the Lakota leader forced the Canadian authorities to consider the status of Indigenous refugees under British treaties. This movement did not secure the territory of the Lakota in perpetuity, but it delayed their forced relocation. The delay allowed the community to preserve their social structures during a period of intense pressure. Further south, in the arid mountains of what is now Arizona and New Mexico, Apache leaders developed a different method of defense. Cochise and later Geronimo did not assemble large armies to meet their opponents in open valleys. They operated in small, highly mobile groups that relied on a precise understanding of desert hydrology and mountain passes. The physical geography of the region favored these small detachments over larger military columns. To survive in these dry canyons, Apache groups utilized tinajas, which are natural rock basins that collect rainwater. These depressions in the sandstone and granite can hold water for weeks after a storm, hidden from travelers who do not know their locations. An Apache tracker could locate these water sources by observing the flight of birds or the presence of specific desert plants like the cottonwood tree. By moving between these hidden water sources, a group of 30 fighters could evade thousands of soldiers. The pursuit required the United States Army to build a network of supply depots and heliograph stations to send messages across the peaks. This system of mirrors flashed Morse code using sunlight, but the installation and maintenance of these stations cost the military vast sums. The Apache strategy made the conquest of the Southwest extremely expensive in both money and manpower. Indigenous nations did not view the conflicts of European powers as contests between good and evil, but rather as opportunities to secure their own borders. During the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, many communities aligned themselves with the British Crown. This choice was based on the calculation that a monarch 3,000 miles away was less dangerous than a young republic of farmers seeking land. The British government had previously established the Proclamation Line, which attempted to limit colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. When the American Civil War began, Native leaders again faced the choice of alignment. In the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, different factions within the Cherokee and Creek nations chose to align with either the Union or the Confederacy. Some leaders signed treaties with the Confederate government to protect their slaveholding interests and to secure promises of representation. Other factions remained loyal to the federal government, leading to internal conflicts that split families and destroyed settlements. The struggle for sovereignty did not end when the armed conflicts ceased. In the late 19th century, the arena of resistance shifted to the legal systems of the states that had claimed their lands. Standing Bear, a Ponca chief, brought a lawsuit in a federal court in Nebraska. The legal question was whether a Native American was recognized as a person under United States law. Standing Bear had been arrested for leaving his reservation to bury his son in their ancestral homeland. The journey required walking hundreds of miles through winter weather, carrying the remains of his child. In the courtroom, Standing Bear stretched out his hand and argued that the blood flowing through his veins was the same color as the judge's blood. The ruling in his favor established that Native individuals possessed the right of habeas corpus, meaning they could not be detained without legal cause. This decision did not restore the lost lands of the Ponca, but it created a legal precedent that challenged the absolute authority of the Indian agents. In the final decades of the 19th century, the focus of government policy shifted from military subjugation to cultural transformation. Reformers like Richard Henry Pratt argued that the cost of fighting Native groups was higher than the cost of educating their children in distant institutions. Pratt established the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, in an old military barracks. The physical plant of the school was designed to enforce discipline through architecture and daily routine. The main building featured long, drafty dormitories where children slept on iron cots. The daily schedule was regulated by a steam whistle that blew at regular intervals to signal the transition between lessons, meals, and manual labor. To understand the scale of this operation, one must examine the process of arrival. Children were transported by train from reservations in the west to the eastern boarding schools. Upon arrival, staff members stripped the children of their homemade clothing, which was often burned or placed in storage. The school tailors then issued uniforms made of coarse wool, designed to match the style of military academies. The next step was the cutting of the hair. In many Plains cultures, long hair was associated with mourning or spiritual strength, and the removal of it was a source of deep distress. The school barbers used manual clippers, which were iron tools with 2 handles and a series of sharp teeth. The barbers squeezed the handles together to slide the teeth across each other, cutting the hair close to the scalp. This physical alteration was accompanied by the assignment of a new English name. The teachers recorded these names in large ledger books, pairing them with the student's tribal identity for administrative purposes. The primary tool of assimilation was the suppression of the native languages. If a student spoke their mother tongue, they faced physical punishment, which often involved standing in a corner for hours or being whipped with a leather strap. The children were forced to learn English through repetition and rote memorization. The classroom instruction focused on reading simple texts and learning basic arithmetic. The afternoons were dedicated to industrial training. For boys, this meant learning to shoe horses, repair shoes, or work in the school print shop. For girls, the training involved laundry work, sewing, and the preparation of large meals using wood-fired stoves. The goal was to train the students for low-wage labor in white communities, preventing them from returning to their traditional lifestyles. A child who spoke a word of their native language in the hallway or classroom faced immediate physical punishment. The instructors used wooden rulers or leather straps to strike the palms of the children. Sometimes, the teachers forced a child to stand in a corner for hours with a bar of yellow lye soap held in their mouth. Lye soap was made by mixing animal fat with sodium hydroxide, which was obtained by leaching water through hardwood ashes in a wooden barrel. The water dissolved the soluble potash from the ashes, producing a caustic liquid that chemically reacted with the fat to form soap. When placed in the mouth, this alkaline substance irritated the mucous membranes, causing a burning sensation and a bitter taste. The punishment aimed to associate the native language with physical pain and humiliation. Children reacted to this discipline in different ways, with some adopting English quickly to avoid the strap. Others ceased speaking altogether, entering a state of silence that lasted for months. The administrators interpreted this silence as a sign of intellectual inferiority rather than psychological trauma. Official reports from the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs and the Canadian Department of Indian Affairs stated that the goal of the schools was to sever tribal relations. The policy was designed to eliminate the legal and cultural existence of indigenous nations. If the children forgot their languages, they could not understand the treaties their grandfathers had signed. Without this understanding, the next generation would not be able to claim ancestral lands or sovereign rights. The trauma of these experiences did not end when a student left the institution. The survivors carried the effects of the discipline into their adult lives, which altered how they raised their own children. A mother who had been beaten for speaking her language often chose not to teach that language to her children. She believed she was protecting them from the violence she had excited. The complex grammar of these languages, which had developed over thousands of years, ceased to be spoken at the family kitchen table. This silence affected the household environment as parents struggled to express affection or manage anger. The grandchildren of survivors often grew up in homes marked by this unspoken tension. The loss of a language meant the loss of a specific way of understanding the physical world. Many indigenous languages of North America used complex verb structures that did not exist in English. For example, a verb could change its suffix to indicate whether the speaker had witnessed an action or had only heard about it from someone else. Other verbs indicated whether the action was performed in cooperation with the listener, or if it showed respect for the animal being hunted. Kinship terms were highly specific, using different words for a mother's older sister and a mother's younger sister. These terms established precise social obligations and duties within the community. When these words disappeared, the ecological knowledge contained within them was also lost. The names for plants often described their medicinal uses, their growth cycles, or their relationship to specific soil types. The names for rivers and hills recorded historical water levels, migration routes of elk, and patterns of seasonal frost. The boarding schools disrupted the transmission of this knowledge by keeping children away from their families during the seasons of harvest and ceremony. The children returned to their communities as young adults who could no longer converse with their grandparents. This separation created a generational gap that interrupted the performance of seasonal rituals. The conditions inside the schools were often unsanitary, leading to frequent outbreaks of tuberculosis, influenza, and measles. The buildings lacked proper ventilation, and the dormitory beds were placed close together, allowing airborne pathogens to spread quickly. Tuberculosis was caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which spread when an infected person coughed or sneezed. The bacteria entered the lungs of healthy children, where they multiplied and destroyed lung tissue. The school infirmaries were understaffed and lacked proper medicine. Many children died in these wards without their parents being notified. For decades, the families of these children maintained that many students had died and were buried near the schools. In the early 2020s, investigators began to search the grounds of former residential schools using ground-penetrating radar. This technology used an antenna to send pulses of high-frequency radio waves into the soil. The radio waves traveled through the ground until they hit a boundary between different materials, such as soil and stone, or disturbed and undisturbed earth. When the wave hit this boundary, a portion of the energy reflected back to the receiver on the surface. The device recorded the time it took for the signal to return, allowing technicians to map subsurface anomalies. These radar sweeps revealed hundreds of unmarked graves in orchards, fields, and beneath schoolyards. The school administrators had buried the deceased children without grave markers or public records. The parents of these children had been told only that their child had run away or died of illness, with no details provided. The discovery of these graves forced governments and churches to acknowledge the scale of the deaths. Several church organizations initiated internal reviews of their records to identify the names of the children who had died. Former students testified before public commissions describing the institutional environment of their childhoods. The survivors remembered the smell of coal smoke and carbolic acid disinfectant in the drafty brick buildings. They recalled the sound of hard-soled shoes on the floorboards at night and the iron bars on the dormitory windows. Despite the strict supervision, students found small ways to resist the assimilation policy. They whispered their native languages under their blankets at night when the monitors were asleep. Some students hid small items, such as dried roots or pieces of beaded hide, inside the seams of their school uniforms. Others memorized traditional songs and sang them quietly in the laundry rooms and barns. These acts of resistance ensured that the languages did not disappear entirely. Some children ran away from the schools, walking dozens of kilometers back to their reservations by following railway lines. They used the stars to navigate at night, sleeping in haystacks or thickets during the day to avoid search parties. Although the policy aimed to eradicate indigenous identities, the nations survived. Today, grandchildren are learning the languages from recorded cylinders and surviving elders. The words that were once forbidden in the classroom are being spoken again by a new generation of speakers. The revival of suppressed languages is taking place in classrooms across North America. Children attend immersion schools where they speak the tongues their grandparents were using. Universities offer courses in traditional legal systems, guided by elders who studied those systems in secret. Ceremonies that were once restricted to hidden clearings or shuttered rooms are now conducted under the open sky. The consequences of the boarding school era persist within families and communities. These effects appear in public health statistics and in the hesitancy of elders to discuss their childhoods. Yet the survival of these cultures represents a significant failure of official erasure policies. The languages that were once restricted to quiet whispers are now spoken on school playgrounds. The common public perception of indigenous people relies on a set of visual cliches. This image typically features a man on horseback wearing dark braids, a feathered headdress, and fringed buckskin. This representation appeared repeatedly in early television, motion pictures, and commercial advertising. The uniform figure is a composite creation assembled by illustrators and writers. This image replaced the history of hundreds of distinct nations with a single caricature. The process of creating this caricature began with two contrasting concepts. These were the concept of the peaceful child of nature and the concept of the violent warrior. The concept of the peaceful child of nature presented indigenous people as simple, innocent, and lacking political organization. This perspective suggested they were destined to disappear before industrial progress. The opposing concept depicted them as violent and incapable of organized social life. Both concepts served to deny the complexity of indigenous societies. Historical records show these societies engaged in complex political activities. Leaders negotiated treaties, formed regional alliances, and managed trade networks that crossed the continent. Some communities managed local resources through structured agricultural systems. Other groups experienced internal political disputes, made poor economic decisions, or engaged in warfare. The cinematic depiction of these societies was established during the early decades of the film industry in California. Film directors required a generic character that could represent any native group. Wardrobe departments combined elements from different cultures to create a standard costume. They placed feathered headdresses from the Great Plains on actors portraying people from the woodlands. This process compressed the diversity of more than 500 distinct nations. In these films, agricultural communities that lived in permanent stone towns were depicted as nomadic horsemen. The physical mechanics of early film production reinforced these stereotypes. Directors relied on a small inventory of props and costumes to minimize production costs. To understand the scale of these film operations, one can look at the physical construction of a standard movie set in the mid-20th century. Film studios constructed outdoor sets using painted canvas and wooden frames to represent plains lodges. The costumes were made from heavy, chemically dyed cowhide rather than brain-tanned deer skin. Brain tanning is a specific chemical process used to preserve hides. The brain of the animal contains emulsified oils that break down the stiff fibers of the skin. Workers first scraped the hair and flesh from the hide using bone tools. They then rubbed the cooked, mashed brain tissue into the wet skin. After the oils penetrated the fibers, the hide was stretched and pulled continuously over a rope or pole until it dried completely. This mechanical stretching prevented the collagen fibers from hardening, leaving the leather soft and water-resistant. Finally, the hide was smoked over a damp wood fire. The smoke deposited aldehydes in the leather, which kept it soft even after it became wet in the rain. Film wardrobe departments bypassed this labor-intensive process by purchasing commercial, chrome-tanned leather. This leather was stiff and did not move naturally during action scenes. To compensate, customers added long fringe to the sleeves and trousers to create the illusion of movement on screen. These commercial garments were distributed to extras regardless of the historical setting of the film. The same fringed shirts appeared in movies set in the deserts of the Southwest and the forests of the Northeast. The actors, who often came from unrelated ethnic backgrounds, were instructed to perform repetitive movements. Over several decades, these repeated visual elements became accepted as historical truth. The imagery spread from movie screens into consumer products, toys, and sports team logos. During this process, several cultural practices were invented by writers and attributed to native groups. One invented practice was the universal use of the term Great Spirit in literature. Another was the idea that all native councils used a physical object to designate who was allowed to speak. While some groups used formal protocols to govern discussions, the specific concept of the talking stick was widely popularized by non-native authors. For many decades, writers published speeches that were attributed to historical leaders, but were actually written by English-speaking authors. These texts were printed in school books and quoted by politicians. The actual speeches of native leaders concerning land titles, legal treaties, and political sovereignty were rarely recorded in public archives. The public became accustomed to a version of history created by translators and dramatists. The physical process of treaty documentation illustrates how these negotiations were recorded. Government clerks used heavy iron presses to copy handwritten documents onto thin paper. A copying press worked by transferring fresh ink from an original letter to a damp sheet of tissue paper. The clerk placed the original document face up on a steel plate. A sheet of moist tissue paper was laid on top of the original, followed by an oiled paperboard. The clerk turned a heavy cast iron wheel at the top of the press. This wheel turned a threaded screw which forced a flat metal plate down onto the papers. The pressure forced the wet ink from the original sheet into the fibers of the damp tissue paper. This process created a mirrored copy on the tissue paper, which could be read through the thin page. These copies were bound into ledgers and stored in government offices. The actual statements of the translation interpreters were often summarized or altered during this copying process. The written records prioritized the legal language of land cessions over the detailed arguments presented by the native negotiators. This system of documentation created an official archive that omitted the political arguments of the indigenous delegates. The resulting public records supported the narrative presented in popular literature and theatrical shows. The official archives of treaties preserved the legalistic prose of land cessions, while omitting the oral arguments of the native delegates. Outside these formal channels of statecraft, the portrayal of indigenous people transformed into a commodity for entertainment. Sports spectators painted their faces with pigment and wore replica headdresses constructed from dyed turquoise feathers. These headdresses were modeled on the sacred regalia of Plains leaders, which historically required specific deeds of bravery to earn. A single war bonnet required dozens of eagle tail feathers, which were acquired through trade or specific hunting rituals. The maker drilled the base of each quill and threaded a rawhide cord through the holes to secure the feathers to a brow band of tanned deer hide. This band was then decorated with glass seed beads imported from Venice or Bohemia. The beads were applied using a lazy stitch technique, where 5 or 6 beads were strung on a single thread and secured to the leather in parallel rows. This painstaking work was replaced in factories by cheap felt bands and plastic beads glued to cardboard tubes. Merchandisers manufactured rubber axes and cartoon logos for athletic teams, establishing a commercial shorthand that reduced diverse populations to a singular caricature. This practice trained generations of observers to view indigenous populations as fictional characters rather than contemporary neighbors. The normalization of these images influenced daily language, popularizing phrases like Indian giver to describe a person who retracted a gift. The term originated from a cultural misunderstanding of reciprocal exchange systems. In many Eastern Woodlands communities, a gift was not a permanent transfer of private property, but an invitation to establish an ongoing relationship. When a European settler received a pipe or a basket, the giver expected a gift of equal value in return, or the return of the original item if no relationship was formed. The settler, operating under European property law, viewed the transaction as absolute and interpreted the request for return as dishonesty. This linguistic relic persisted alongside family myths of ancestral Cherokee grandmothers, which individuals often used to claim native identity without holding citizenship in a sovereign tribal nation. Treaty rights and legal sovereignty remained distinct from these cultural myths. Under the United States Constitution, treaties carried the same legal weight as federal statutes. This status meant that tribal nations operated as governments, not as racial minority groups or interest groups. The legal framework of tribal sovereignty allowed native nations to establish their own court systems, tax structures, and law enforcement agencies within their reservation boundaries. A tribal court operated through a combination of written statutes and traditional customary law. When a dispute arose over land use, the judges examined both modern property deeds and oral histories regarding family usage rights. The court reporter recorded the proceedings using a stenograph machine, translating the spoken testimonies into a written record that could be used in federal appeals. These courts maintained jurisdiction over civil matters involving non-members on reservation land, a point of constant legal friction with surrounding state governments. Before the arrival of European explorers, the continent contained hundreds of distinct languages organized into dozens of language families. In the Northeast, speakers of Iroquoian languages used complex verb structures that incorporated nouns directly into the verb root. A speaker could express an entire sentence, such as, "I have bought a new house," in a single word by combining the morphemes for house, purchase, and newness into a single phonetic unit. Further south, Muskogean languages predominated in the forested valleys of the Gulf Coast. Across the Central Plains, Siouan dialects served as the primary means of communication for agriculturalists and nomadic hunters alike. Athabascan languages stretched from the subarctic forests of modern Canada to the arid plateaus of the Southwest, where Apache and Navajo speakers developed dialects that shared root words with their northern relatives. Along the Great Basin, Uto-Aztecan tongues linked the high deserts to the Valley of Mexico, showing linguistic relationships that spanned thousands of kilometers. The physical structures built by these societies reflected their local environments. In the northern plains, earth lodges protected families from sub-zero winter temperatures. The builders constructed these lodges by excavating a circular pit about 1 meter deep. They erected 4 central timber posts made of cottonwood trunks, which they joined at the top with heavy beams. They then leaned smaller poles against this frame to form a conical roof, leaving a central smoke hole. Over this wooden frame, they layered willow branches, followed by a thick thatch of prairie grass. Finally, they packed damp sod over the grass, tamping it down to create an airtight insulation barrier that could withstand blizzard winds. In the summer, the thick sod walls kept the interior cool by blocking the heat of the sun. On the Pacific coast, cedar plank houses served as permanent winter residences. The builders split giant red cedar trunks using wedges made of elkhorn and heavy stone mauls to create flat boards that were several meters long. These boards were lashed to a framework of cedar posts using cords made of twisted cedar bark. The planks were arranged horizontally so they could be slid aside to let in light or channel smoke from internal cooking fires. The front of the house often featured a carved portal pole that displayed the crests of the family lineage. This carving process required the artist to char the wood with hot embers and scrape away the blackened fibers with stone adzes to shape the figures of killer whales, bears, and ravens. Popular histories often ended their narratives around the year 1900, creating the impression that native populations disappeared from the modern landscape. This chronological gap left the public unprepared for the reality of contemporary indigenous life. By the early 21st century, the indigenous population of North America had recovered to numbers comparable to those estimated before European contact. This growing population lived in suburban neighborhoods, worked in urban centers, and populated rural reservations. A teenager on the Pine Ridge Reservation scrolled through social media on a mobile phone while a native biologist analyzed soil samples in a university laboratory. In community centers, drum groups gathered to rehearse songs for upcoming gatherings. The singers sat in a circle around a single large drum made of stretched elk hide. The drum head was tensioned using rawhide laces threaded through holes along the edge of the skin. As the air in the room warmed, the hide expanded, lowering the pitch of the instrument. To correct this, the singers placed the drum near a portable heater or rubbed the surface with their palms to restore the tension. The lead singer started the song with a solo phrase, and the other singers joined in unison, striking the drum with padded sticks in a steady, synchronized rhythm. In offices across the country, lawyers drafted legal briefs to defend water rights in federal courts. They used databases to retrieve treaties signed in the 19th century, comparing the historical boundaries with modern municipal water maps. These legal efforts were supported by language revitalization programs. In classrooms and digital meeting spaces, adults and children worked to learn languages that had been suppressed during the boarding school era. Immersion schools in New York and Oklahoma taught mathematics and science entirely in Mohawk and Cherokee. Teachers created new vocabulary words for modern technologies by combining traditional root words. For example, a computer might be described as that which calculates quickly in the native tongue. This linguistic work ensured that the languages remained functional tools for daily life, rather than static museum specimens. The continuation of these languages linked modern communities to their ancestors without relying on the imagery of historical reenactments. Tribal communities established radio stations that broadcasted daily programming in languages such as Lakota, Ojibwe, and Hawaiian. These projects required setting up transmission towers, tuning mixers, and obtaining licenses from federal communications authorities. The broadcasts reached listeners across vast rural reservation areas where physical travel was difficult. On these stations, announcers spoke only their native tongues, discussing local news, weather patterns, and agricultural prices. This work represented a deliberate effort to reverse the policies of 19th century boarding schools. In those schools, staff members punished children who spoke their native languages by washing their mouths with harsh lye soap. Administrators also used heavy leather straps across the knuckles of students to enforce English-only rules. Today, those once forbidden words appear on public street signs, school banners, and official government documents. This change is not a simple exercise in nostalgia, but a structured process of cultural engineering. The revitalization of these languages proceeds through systematic, scientific methods. Linguists collaborate with the remaining fluent elders of a community to document every distinct sound and grammatical construction. In many communities, only one elderly speaker remains alive, acting as a single living library. Teams of researchers gather around this person with digital video cameras and directional microphones to record their speech. They work quickly to capture the vocabulary before the speaker passes away. The digital recordings undergo a specific technical process to preserve the audio. Engineers transfer the sound waves into digital formats, saving them as compressed audio files on hard drives. Technicians use software to isolate the speaker's voice, removing background noise like wind or passing cars. These files are then uploaded to online databases where educators can access them. A word spoken into a microphone in a quiet room becomes a resource for future generations. 10 years later, a parent uses that same recorded pronunciation to teach their newborn child. This process forms the foundation of a broader cultural recovery. While language is not the entirety of a culture, it serves as the structure that supports communal stories. When a community reclaims its language, traditional ceremonies expand, and local humor becomes more accessible. Old songs which had been translated into English with poor results regain their original meaning and rhythm. The recovery of language often coincides with the reassertion of political authority. In the United States, Canada, and Latin America, native nations operate as distinct governments rather than simple ethnic groups. Tribal sovereignty remains a legal fact based on the existence of these nations before European contact. This sovereignty is managed through a complex network of treaties, court decisions, and statutory rights. Many tribal nations operate their own police departments, court systems, schools, and medical clinics. They negotiate complex agreements regarding water rights, energy development, and casino revenues. These operations require substantial administrative infrastructure, including legal offices, accounting departments, and public record systems. When legal disputes arise, Supreme Courts must determine which government holds jurisdiction over specific parcels of land. They must decide which police force has the authority to make arrests and which government can levy taxes. The legal disputes often focus on precise definitions of land status. Under federal law, land within a reservation boundary can be held in trust by the government, owned by the tribe, or owned by non-native individuals. To determine jurisdiction, lawyers must trace the title of a specific plot back to 19th century allotment records. This involves examining large paper maps and county land registries to verify the exact status of a property. If a crime occurs on the plot owned by a non-native person within reservation borders, the legal authority to prosecute depends on this title history. These technical distinctions determine which court handles a case and which laws apply to the land. Tribal governments use this legal authority to protect their resources and residents. They enact environmental regulations to prevent industrial pollution in local rivers and lakes. They also establish child welfare systems to ensure that native children remain within their communities. Sovereignty serves as a practical tool to resist unwanted external projects, such as mining operations or waste disposal sites. This legal reality is constantly tested and redefined through court challenges and legislative acts. At the same time, Native individuals work in diverse professional fields outside of traditional tribal territories. Scientists of indigenous descent contribute to space exploration projects, including the design of Mars landing equipment. Artists adapt traditional design principles, such as Haida formline art, for exhibition in international museums. Writers publish novels that receive national literary awards, while lawyers argue cases before federal appeals courts. Native astronauts have traveled into orbit, bringing items like traditional beadwork and eagle feathers into space stations. In research laboratories, indigenous geneticists and ecologists study the ethics of biological data collection. They work to ensure that native communities retain control over genetic samples and receive compensation for traditional plant knowledge. Large populations of native people live in major urban areas far from their ancestral homelands. Significant communities exist in cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo. These residents establish urban Indian centers, organize annual powwows, and form student unions. Many individuals navigate multiple cultural environments, moving between urban professional roles and traditional tribal responsibilities. Some work as software developers during the day and participate in ceremonial dances during the weekend. Others play in rock bands while maintaining their roles as traditional singers in their home communities. Native communities frequently lead environmental campaigns across the Americas. They block the construction of pipelines and stop logging trucks on rural roads. They challenge the construction of dams and open-pit mines through both protests and legal actions. These efforts are often connected to a broader movement to return land to tribal control. This process does not necessarily require the eviction of non-native residents. Instead, it focuses on restoring native management over sacred sites, state forests, and critical watersheds. In some regions, tribal nations now co-manage national parks alongside federal agencies. Traditional ecological practices are also receiving attention from modern scientists. Ecologists study traditional burning practices, which involve setting low-intensity fires during the wet season to clear underbrush. This technique prevents the accumulation of dry fuel that leads to catastrophic wildfires during the summer. Scientists also study indigenous fishing structures and agricultural systems that maintain soil fertility without chemical fertilizers. These ancient methods are increasingly viewed as useful tools for addressing modern environmental challenges. European cartographers drew lines on parchment to divide the continent into clean, empty sectors. These maps ignored the existing systems of spatial organization that native populations had maintained for generations. Indigenous communities navigated by landmarks that carried specific historical narratives, naming hills and watercourses after ancestral events. Traveling parties memorized long sequences of geographical features to guide their journeys across vast distances. A traveler learned the sequence of ridges, distinctive trees, and creek crossings through spoken recitations before setting out. This method allowed messengers to travel hundreds of kilometers without physical charts. To navigate without instruments, travelers also relied on the alignment of specific tree species. In the northern forests, moss grew consistently on the side of trunks shielded from the direct midday sun. Prevailing winds bent the upper branches of spruce and fir trees toward the east. By observing these subtle biological indicators, a traveler could maintain a straight heading even under dense cloud cover. The landscape was not a trackless wilderness, but a dense network of familiar signs. These paths often followed the natural migration routes of large mammals like bison and elk. The heavy animals chose the most efficient paths through mountainous terrain, avoiding steep inclines and marshy bottoms. Over centuries of use, the hooves of millions of animals packed the earth into hard, durable tracks. Indigenous groups cleared fallen timber from these routes to keep them open for trade parties. Many of these ancient routes eventually became the foundations for modern asphalt highways and railroad lines. Legal battles over resource ownership rely on treaties signed in the 18th and 19th centuries. The United States Constitution recognizes these agreements as the supreme law of the land, equal in status to federal statutes. Tribal attorneys present documents written on crumbling paper to defend contemporary water rights in federal courts. These cases require the reconstruction of historical land usage to prove continuous occupation of specific watersheds. Lawyers trace agricultural records back to the colonial era to establish the volume of water needed to sustain tribal agriculture. The process of legal research involves examining the handwritten journals of early government agents. Researchers look for descriptions of irrigation ditches, cultivated fields, and fish traps built by native communities. These entries demonstrate that the signatories of the treaties intended to maintain their agricultural lifestyle. Under federal law, a treaty reservation of land automatically includes the water necessary to make that land productive. The courts call this principle the Winters Doctrine, named after a landmark Supreme Court case from the early 20th century. To divert water from rivers, early farmers constructed low dams out of willow branches, stones, and mud. These structures did not block the entire flow of the river, but redirected a portion of it into hand-dug canals. The canals ran along the natural contours of the hillsides, maintaining a very gentle slope to prevent erosion of the canal bed. Wooden headgates controlled the flow of water from the main canal into smaller distribution ditches. By raising or lowering a simple wooden board, a farmer adjusted the volume of water entering a specific field. This system allowed communities to grow crops in arid regions that received less than 25 centimeters of rain per year. Modern tribal governments operate administrative offices, court systems, and police departments within their jurisdictions. There are over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States, each maintaining its own constitution and code of laws. These governments manage budgets for healthcare, housing, and education while defending their borders against state encroachment. A tribal council meeting often begins with discussions of federal grant allocations before moving to local land disputes. The proceedings are recorded digitally and archived for future legal reference, preserving the decisions of the council. Traditional narratives survive through structured oral transmission from older speakers to younger generation. In these cultures, historical accounts are preserved through specialized songs and epic poems. The structure of these songs includes specific mnemonic devices, such as repeating refines and strict rhythmic patterns to prevent alteration of the text. A singer practiced for decades to memorize thousands of verses without changing a single syllable. This precise repetition ensured that historical information remained accurate over hundreds of years. The physical mechanics of human speech require precise coordination of the vocal cord, tongue, and lips. In many indigenous languages, the meaning of a word changes depending on the pitch of the vowel. This feature, known as tone, requires the speaker to control the tension of their vocal folds with great accuracy. To produce a high tone, the muscles of the larynx contract, stretching the vocal cords and increasing the frequency of their vibration. A low tone requires the relaxation of these muscles, which slows the vibration of the air passing through the glottis. Younger learners practice these subtle physical adjustments to achieve native pronunciation. Digital audio equipment now helps preservationists record the voices of the few remaining fluent speakers. Linguists use high-quality microphones to capture the subtle glottal stops and nasalized vowels of endangered languages. These recordings are digitized and stored in secure databases to prevent degradation over time. Software developers use these audio files to build mobile applications that teach vocabulary to school children. The digital files also provide material for academic researchers studying the syntax of non-Indo-European languages. These modern technologies support a broader movement to assert cultural independence. Communities establish native medium schools where children learn history, science, and mathematics entirely in their ancestral tongues. This educational method helps children develop cognitive flexibility while reinforcing their connection to their heritage. The success of these programs has inspired similar efforts among minority language groups worldwide. The survival of these languages ensures that unique systems of environmental knowledge are not lost to history. For centuries, communities along the major river valleys built large earth lodges that accommodated dozens of residents. The construction began with a circle of heavy wooden posts set deep into the ground. Builders joined these upright supports with horizontal beams to form a sturdy, octagonal frame. They leaned smaller poles against this framework to create the sloping walls of the structure. The outer surface was covered with layers of willow branches, dry grass, and a thick coating of sod. The sod layer provided insulation against the freezing winter winds and the intense heat of the summer sun. The soil contained living grass roots that bound the earth together, preventing rain from washing the roof away. An opening at the peak of the roof allowed smoke from the central hearth to escape while letting in daylight. The interior floor was excavated about a meter below the surrounding ground level to take advantage of the earth's natural warmth. These lodges stood for decades, requiring only occasional maintenance to replace rotted support timbers. Further west, coastal groups constructed large houses using planks split from giant red cedar trees. The builders felled the trees using stone adzes and controlled burning at the base of the trunk. They split the logs into wide, flat boards by driving wedges of elk antler into the wood grain. These planks were tied to a heavy post and beam frame using ropes made from twisted cedar bark. The overlapping design of the wall planks kept out the persistent coastal rain while allowing ventilation. These structures hosted large communal gatherings and stored dried salmon for winter consumption. These diverse architectural styles reflect the deep relationship between indigenous societies and their local environments. Builders utilize the materials closest at hand, adapting their techniques to the specific challenges of their regional climates. The resulting structures were durable, functional, and integrated into the natural landscape. Modern architects study these historic building methods to design energy-efficient structures that minimize environmental impact. The principles of passive heating and local material sourcing remain highly relevant to contemporary sustainable design.